Hey everybody, I'm Emily Sweeney from the Boston Globe, and I want to thank you for joining us for this latest round of lessons brought to you by the New England First Amendment Coalition. During this class, you're going to learn about remote public access to government meetings in Maine. Be sure to check out our previous classes on our YouTube channel and on our website, nefac.org. And before we start, I want to recognize the Estate of Gloria Negri for supporting these classes. Gloria was a trailblazing journalist at the Boston Globe for more than 50 years, and this program is part of her legacy of newsroom education and her lifelong commitment to local journalism. I also want to thank the Rhode Island Foundation and the New England Society of News Editors for their continued support, and a big thanks to you for taking the time today to learn how to keep government open and accountable in your state. And with us today is Brenda Kielty, the first and current Public Access Ombudsman for Maine, a position she began in 2012. And she's going to walk us through remote access to government meetings in Maine. Brenda, thanks so much for being here.
I'm going to be speaking about just one element of the Freedom of Access Act, which is our access to public records and meetings law in the state of Maine. So I'm not able in this short period of time to sort of give a big background of the statute. We're diving right into remote participation. So if you have questions relating to larger questions about the statute or how this fits in, feel free to bring those at the end of the session and any other questions that come up along the way. I did leave my contact information, and also the state of Maine has a website related to FOA if you want to follow up on that as well. So today we're talking about remote participation, and I did want to make the connection for everyone with the underlying purposes of FOA, because anytime that we're looking at either the law itself or the implementation of the law, we always want to come back to why. Why do we even have this statute? What is the point of this? And so FOA itself embodies the principle that public proceedings exist to aid in the conduct of the people's business. And it expressly covers both actions must be taken openly, and also that deliberations must be conducted openly. So we're not only talking about the votes taken by a public body in a public proceeding, we're also talking about all the discussions and the dialogue, the deliberations that lead up to that vote. And then I think another really important aspect of the purpose of FOA has been articulated by the Maine Supreme Judicial Court. And this is in reference to FOIA. And here we talk about an informed citizenry vital to the functioning of a democratic society, needed to check against corruption and to hold the governors accountable to the governed. So these two big themes of openness and accountability underlie the statute. And so as we go through the provisions related to remote participation, it's just good to keep in mind, do these provisions facilitate those purposes? And any changes that could possibly be suggested facilitate those purposes. So let's dive right in. Remote participation is relatively new in Maine. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of the evolution and then talk about where we are right now. And I think this is important to at least see, are there trends, or, has this arced in certain directions? What do we expect the future to bring for remote participation? But prior to the pandemic, there was no provision in the state of Maine for remote meetings in the statute. And the AG's office had put out a letter back in 1979 related to a public body voting by phone. And those were the days, right? And the AGs took the position that couldn't happen, that in order to vote, for votes to be taken, action to be taken by a public body, the members had to be physically present. And unless specifically authorized by statute to do otherwise. There are a very small number of state level agencies or statewide boards that have written into their own statutes authorizing legislation for remote participation, separate and outside of what FOA has to offer. But we also have a very active group called the Right to Know Advisory Committee that worked for a long time, for years, on legislation to address issues raised by remote meetings, and to try to ensure, while they were looking at those issues, this transparency and openness and access to the deliberations and actions, and to ensure that that remained intact. And although the legislature in Maine passed those provisions for specific agencies, a very small number of them, attempts to move an amendment to FOA itself were unsuccessful. And there are many reasons, I think, for that. But when I look at it, and one thing that I perceived in those discussions was a very strong sentiment in the state of Maine supporting in-person representation. In other words, people were concerned about not being face-to-face, particularly with their elected officials. And there was a concern somehow that the officials would somehow avoid accountability by not facing their public. The other questions were, of course, the IT issues, the lack of broadband, and then there just was not a clear consensus on what the elements of such legislation should be. But then there was COVID, and emergency legislation was enacted on March 18th, 2020. And this added a new section to FOA to temporarily allow certain public bodies to conduct meetings through electronic means. And there were 4 conditions in that legislation. There had to be adequate notice, including the means by which the public could attend remotely. So that had to be included in the notice itself. The board members had to be able to hear and speak to other members, and the public had to be able to hear all of those conversations. The board had to determine that public attendance would be by remote means, and all votes had to be by roll call. So if FOA had not, if COVID had not happened, probably the institution of remote participation would have taken a lot longer to get put in place. But by necessity, in order for government business to proceed, this just had to happen. And there were a lot of bumps in the road along the way. But it worked well enough so that on July 30th, 2021, the emergency law that was permitting these public proceedings, the remote public proceedings, expired. And the legislature enacted a new provision, which is now Section 403B in Title I, making participation in public meetings permanent under certain circumstances. So even though during COVID, there was a real learning curve in Maine with trying to figure out how to make this technology work, how do we do this? Lots of bumps in the road, but I think there was also a realization that there were a lot of positives to having remote access, including a higher level of participation by the public in public meetings. So Zoom was here to stay at that point. And then this Section 403B, Title I, I want to talk just a little bit about some of the basic elements of it, and then later we'll look at how it's been amended. But it added a step that in order to convene, in order to have remote participation, the body would have to convene in person and adopt a written policy after notice and hearing. So this involved a step that was a hearing, a public hearing. And I think the reason for that was a recognition that there could be communities that had a lot to say about whether they wanted their local boards and committees or their select board or their school board to be meeting remotely. And they needed to have an opportunity to air what they had to say. So no remote participation without a policy, and the policy is local. This means your local select board, your local school board, or whatever state level boards or commissions want to meet, whatever public body on any level of government. But it is not an across the board statewide mandate. So each local entity could decide for itself how they wanted to deal with this and whether or not they wanted a policy that was going to allow remote participation. The members could participate remotely only if in-person participation was not practicable. So not practicable is not defined exactly, but there were some examples given in the statute that would be examples, for instance, of something that would not be practicable, but this is not an exclusive list. Emergency or urgent issue that requires the entire body to be remote, illness or physical condition, absence with significant travel difficulties, significant distance from the meeting site for a statewide body. And then for many of our public and members who live in island communities in Maine, the difficulty of traveling between or from the islands. So this is a list of things that could create a situation where it would be not practicable to be in person and therefore would allow a member to participate remotely. And if any member participated remotely, then the public must be allowed to also participate remotely. And there had to be an effective means of communication between members and the public if the body allows public input during the proceeding, which is not always the case. So you can see now we're creating a scheme that has two real hurdles. The first one is the policy. Your community has to decide that it does actually want this to happen. And then the second hurdle is that this in-person presence is really an expectation unless it's not practicable, right? The notice had to contain certain information, including the means by which the public may access. The location for in-person attendance by the public had to be provided unless it was an emergency or urgent issue and there was going to be a fully remote meeting. All votes by roll call. The documents, meeting materials have to be available to the members of the public participating remotely, that to the same extent customarily available, so that they wouldn't be at a disadvantage because it was a remote meeting. They'd still be able to get the packet. And then, of course, the telephonic or video technology or other means to reasonably accommodate a disability. So these are all requirements, and any community that would decide to adopt a policy would include these elements in their policy and talk about how they were going to take care of that. But there was another problem. There were barriers to in-person meetings still, because we still, in certain situations, had high rates of COVID in small communities, or there were other reasons people were really uncertain about meeting together in groups. And, so actually it made passing a policy to allow remote meetings difficult because you had to do it in person for those bodies who had not enacted a policy prior to July 30, 2021, or weren't even convened at that time. So for instance, we had new boards that were being created after this law had passed, and the law only allowed them the possibility of meeting in person to create a policy to meet remotely, but there were reasons why they might not even want to meet in person to create that policy. So in August 8th, 2022, the statute was amended to allow bodies without a policy to meet remotely and conduct a hearing and vote on a policy to meet remotely. If the chair determined there was an emergency or urgent issue, notice is given and the policy was made available in advance, and the members assented by 2/3 majority to this determination. So this is, again, just trying to make sure that if a community wanted to institute remote participation or a board, that having to come in person to actually pass that policy would not be the problem, that they could do it remotely if the conditions allowed it. And then There are further amendments to the statute as time goes by, and people are becoming in Maine more accustomed to the remote platforms. We're getting better at how to handle Zoom and the other platforms. It's just becoming more the ordinary course of business, whereas earlier it seemed it was an enormous change. So now in 2022, the section, and remember, section 403B has only been in existence for a year. And already a year later, an amendment is enacted that the remote meeting policy that had to previously include the expectation that members would be physically present unless not practicable is completely removed. So there's no language currently in the statute related to this earlier pretty large chunk of the statute that created this hurdle where we're really going to expect you to be in person unless it's not practicable and you have to have reasons for that. That's now gone. So there is no preference necessarily in the statute for remote versus in person. The only thing is you have to decide by policy, but there's no, not practicable language anymore. This new provision in 403B allows the body to limit public attendance only to remote means if there's an emergency or urgent situation that requires the body to meet remotely. So this is a little bit of different language, urgent situation versus urgent issue that we had earlier. But clearly it's allowing still the body to not have a hybrid meeting, but to have a fully remote meeting under certain circumstances. And then the public would have to be fully remote. And there's also a provision here related to the policies adopted by a body, and that the policy applies to all the boards and commissions or committees within the jurisdiction of that body, unless those other boards or committees adopt their own policy, because we had seen some inconsistency even within a town. The select board might have one policy and the planning board might have another, and they might not be the same, or one might want a policy for remote and the other might say, no, we only want to meet in person. So I think this was an attempt to try to create consistency within a particular jurisdiction. And then in 2023, the changes continue. In 2023, the phrase "and the public" is added to section 403B2, which widened the scope of the application of the remote policy, this term participation. So the language is, a public body subject to this subchapter may allow members of the body and the public to participate in a public proceeding using remote methods. And I'll talk about that for just a minute, because my perception of what that does to the statute is elevates the role of the public, so that it's not just public access, or it's not just members of a body may participate remotely, but it's the members of the body and the public may participate. I'm not sure that it practically changes anything, but I think in terms of putting the language in there and focusing on that is an attempt to bring the needs of the public a little bit further more to the forefront of this statute in this language. There's a new provision now for blanket remote policies. So here we're revisiting the original attempt to create consistency within a jurisdiction, and this changes it up. Here it says a policy applies to a board or committee within the jurisdiction of the body unless the board or committee opts out by adopting its own. That's fine. I think that's not that different. But what's really different is county, municipal, and regional body policies apply within the jurisdiction, and the boards and committees that are subordinate can only opt out if they're specifically authorized. So here, especially with the county, municipal, regional bodies, you're seeing if the select board creates a policy that they're expecting that all the subordinate boards and committees would all have the same policy related to remote participation unless they're authorized by the select board to opt out. So that's just one example of how that could come up. This is an interesting amendment from 2023 related to the right of the public to make a recording of the meeting, the remote meeting. So FOA already allowed the public to make written, taped, or filmed records of public meetings, and that there's a long-standing practice for that, and to live broadcast. So that's not a question at all. If you have an in-person meeting, you can go in and take out your phone and film it, and or do whatever you need to do as long as it doesn't disrupt the proceedings, and there reasonable limitations can be put on that activity. But another 2023 amendment of section 403B gave members of the public a right to record the remote proceedings using the same electronic platform that's used to conduct the meeting, provided that there's no additional cost. The platform allows participants other than the host to enable the record function. And of course, it doesn't interfere with the orderly conduct of the proceeding. So this one this is fairly new. I have not seen any complaints about how this is working or how it's operating. I'm curious to hear from people how this works, because certainly it makes a very convenient mechanism for the public to simply record the meeting that's going on, and there's lots of need for that or interest in that. So I know I'm going so quickly through this, but I just want to do a little recap of where we stand today with section 403B, with the original, what we started with those changes, and then here we are today. And I just picked out, I'm not trying to give you the entire statutory provision, just the points that I think are most interesting for us. Remote methods, in other words, how you conduct the meeting, what kind of platform you do it on, it's limited. So remote methods means telephonic or video technology, but not email, text, or chat. And the chat function can be problematic, and not only for the proceeding, but for record retention as well. But the statute is specific, no email, text, or chat. And so I'm curious, it's one of those areas where I think there is an arc that is inevitable because technology is changing, changes constantly. It seems to be changing at an accelerated pace. And so I think at some point, I'm not sure that this will encompass all the options out there. And it may need another change in the future. No, there's no statewide mandate. So section 403B2, the body may adopt a policy after notice and hearing. So there's nothing in this statute that says every public body must have a policy or must enable remote proceedings. It's not that way in Maine. And again, I have a question about that looking into the future, because if we go back to the purposes of FOA and openness and accountability, I think it's hard to say that remote meetings have not worked toward those goals. I mean, I know in my own work, I am constantly watching public meetings and seeing it. And not only did they conduct it remotely, but they're broadcast or they're put up online and I can watch it. And it is a window to what's going on that you may not have if things are only happening in person. So I have a question about whether or not there'll be some sort of statewide push. And of course, there'll be cost, infrastructure, all of that standing in the way, and still sentiment. There are places in Maine where they just don't want this. They want to be in person. That's the way they are. So, and then no requirement to offer a hybrid meeting with no remote participation by members of the body. So what that means is when members of the body participate remotely, the statute requires that the public be allowed to participate remotely. But what if it's an in-person meeting and no member is meeting remotely? Should the public still have access to that meeting remotely, particularly if there's going to be public comment? Or should, in our statute right now says that you don't have to do that. You could, and it does happen. It happens a lot, I think. But there's no requirement. If the body's not meeting remotely, they are not required to create a online platform or remote participation for members of the public. This is another one I have questions about looking into the future. Our statute also does not create a right to public comment. So if the body allows public comment or is otherwise required to provide an opportunity for public input, because there are certain situations where that is required, FOA does not create an overriding right to public comment. But if it is part of what's going to go on in the meeting, then there have to be an effective means of communication between the body and the public. And then the notice must include how to join remotely. Again, this is just practical. But you know, if there's going to be a hybrid meeting with in-person and remote, then the notice has to identify the location for the in-person and how to join up remotely. Our statute says certain bodies may not meet remotely. They're not allowed, not permitted. Those would be town meetings and regional school unit budget meetings. So those have to be done in person. And then certain bodies are exempt. So the legislature is exempt from this law, and the other few public bodies with specific statutory provisions. Now the legislature, this means the legislature has the option of creating remote, but this does not apply to them. And so that is the end of my slides, and I'm open to any questions that come up. And I'm sorry, this was a really quick, deep dive into remote participation in Maine, but I hope it made sense to people.
Well, we're getting lots of kudos to you, Brenda, in the chat. For putting on a great session. And I want to thank everybody for joining us in our live audience. We have quite a few people here today, so I appreciate everybody taking the time. So yeah, so I think we're all set. Brenda, thank you so much for this session.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
All right, thanks everybody.